Well, first, mute. Let's see. Let me go to share here. Let's see. Can you see that okay, Ben, or someone? Yeah, great. Okay. Alrighty. So first of all, I'm very grateful to Ben and Ellen for this invitation. Here's Ben on the Lee River in now the South China Karst World Heritage Site. I think this is about 2012 or so. Lamb Bledsoe, some of you know, she looks like she was 14. So this is really just kind of like a retrospective, I guess. When Ben called me up, he said, "Well, can you talk about something to do with Karst?" So this is very much what I've been involved in, really, for quite a while and a lot these days. So it really is a pleasure for me to be able to talk about this stuff. I will say two things. One is it has kind of a like what I did on my summer vacation vibe. It's basically it's a kind of history of the last 30 years, and so I apologize in advance about that. And also it's kind of the story that I've seen, and it really isn't about me, but it's very much through my lens. And so it's kind of what I've seen and kind of what my take is on this. What I used to say arguably, and now known is the greatest karst landscape in the world, in my opinion. So the focus here is on various is karst in China, but a lot of the work has been through programs of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Scientific Organization. So when I'm talking about UNESCO programs, I'd like to start with what is the deal? What in fact is UNESCO? A lot of people have heard about it, and fewer people know exactly what it means. So it starts with this. In the at the end of the Second World War, there was more than 50,000 people had died, just from violence. Really the most violent period in the history of the world. And after that meeting, a group of people, or after that war, a group of people got together in London, diplomats, and the United Nations had started. And they said, they just looked around and said, what in the world has gone on here? And what can we do to make this not happen again? And one of the ways that occurred to people was just this, that a lot of the problems was really just misunderstanding, people just not trusting one another, and that comes from not understanding one another. So UNESCO was born, and the idea is that a mechanism for peace is for the world's people to know one another and better understand one another and the world around them. So let's see. Um, well, there we go. And so UNESCO was started, and Alistair MacLean, who wrote much of the Constitution, said this: since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Okay, women were involved, but this is the language of the 1940s, and still the language. But that's the idea. So it's really it's an organization that really is as other parts of the United Nations, really trying to make the world a better, safer, and more peaceful place. I don't know why this is not. Yeah. So UNESCO education, science, and culture. So the science part, there's a great number of programs, and largely what UNESCO is trying to do really through these efforts is communicate, is to increase communication. And in the science part, there's several programs that I'll be addressing here. What I want to focus on tonight are the conservation programs, and that is that there's various UNESCO programs that are really trying to identify and protect, the places with the highest, universal value, both cultural and natural. Here at my base here at Mammoth Cave National Park is both a World Heritage Site and an International Biosphere Reserve. So there really are four different programs of UNESCO in international programs that focus on landscape conservation, resource protection, and that's the World Heritage Convention, the Man and Biosphere Program, global geoparks, which there are none in the United States, and then the Ramsar Convention on wetlands. UNESCO is in Paris, France. So the along with that, a lot of the work that I've been involved in China, in fact, a number of people on this call have been through a UNESCO program called IGCP. Originally, this was the International Geological Correlation Program, and the idea was to, or still is really, to really enhance communication among geoscientists working on particular geologic or environmental thematic areas. And there's been a very nice, in fact, the most successful of all the IGCP projects have been a series of Karst ones starting back in 1990. There are 5-year projects that are again enhancing the collaboration and communication of people. A number of people in this call were at various IGCP conferences in Bowling Green, and these have been all over the world. So originally it was an International Geological Correlation Program. Sort of ultimately, UNESCO changed the name to the International Geoscience Program, but in UNESCO-esque kind of way, kept the IGCP letters, and just because people are used to it. So when you see that disconnect, it's not a typo. Then eventually, what happened was that a lot of really much of the leadership of the Karst IGCP projects was in China in Guilin at the Institute of Karst Geology, and eventually, what happened was that through the history of the Karst IGCP projects, eventually the Karst Institute was successful in getting designation by UNESCO for IRCK. This is the International Research Center on Karst, what's called a Category 2 UNESCO center. So they're not UNESCO employees, but it's under the auspices of UNESCO. And this goes back to 2008. Very, very successful. The main activity, there's been a lot, but the main activity are various training programs that once a year there's a training course in China where the Chinese bring between say 20 and 40 students, hydrologists, hydrogeologists from around the world, and have several weeks of training in Karst. And these are just fabulous. In fact, Sarah Arpin from Kentucky Geological Survey just got back about 3 weeks ago from the last one, and very positive for everyone as far as I can know. Okay, so I like to my Chinese friends use up a lot of my vocabulary and start my talk by saying "Woyo Liangwei Zhongguo Laoshi," and this means that I have two Chinese teachers, and the first is this character here out in front of the Karst Institute, and this is Xu Shake. And Shushaka was alive in the 1600s, and he is essentially Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, kind of all wrapped up in one guy. And in the 1630s, he spent several decades just walking across southwest China, including many of the spectacular karst areas, and he was just interested in everything, but that included caves. And so he was actually exploring and mapping caves in the 1630s. As I like to say, Shushaka was was mapping caves before mapping caves was cool. My other teacher is and I just can't say enough of my gratitude for him. And this is Yuan Deshan. Yuan is as you'll see, he is there's a number of great car scientists, but he is in a handful of people that have really opened up the karst of China to the rest of the world. Professor Yuan is now 94 this year, and living in Guilin, and still coming to work, not every day, but still coming to the office. Is just a spectacular man, and I'm just so grateful from knowing Professor Yuan. Let's see. So if we go through the trajectory of this program, so what ended up happening was that the Communist Party came in 1949. And what's relevant about that was China was essentially closed to the West, to the rest of the world. So years and years went by, and there was very little information about China, generally, but certainly the geology, the geomorphology, the caves of China, people just really didn't have much of an idea of it, people outside of China. And this of course, it changed when Richard Nixon visited China in 1972, and this really began the opening of relations between China and much of the rest of the world, certainly Western cave explorers. So what ended up happening was that there was really two people. Again, there's a lot of great car scientists in China, back then and more, every day. But the two that are really, from my understanding, responsible for opening things up, and that's Professor Yuan here on the left, and I want to acknowledge Song Eiling, my also old friend, Professor Yuan's wife of many years, and it's been very much a partnership. So I'm very grateful for the both of them. And then on the right is Chang Shouyu. And Chung, he unfortunately died from COVID, I think 2 or 3 years ago. But he was with the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And there was really sort of two major thrusts of Western cavers and geologists or karst geologists into China. And one group, kind of British group, came through Guilin and Professor Yuan. And then French and Belgians came, because of the contact with Chung show you. This is Camille Eck from Belgium in Guizhou in 1987. So the first the first karst geologist back into China after this was Marjorie Sweeting from Oxford University, and she made her way there in 1977, and actually went to it was a group from the Royal Academy of various geomorphologists, and they went to different places in China. But one of the places they went was Guilin, and at that time met Yuan Daoxian. So from that, they Marjorie got to Guilin in 77. Several she was able to arrange for Yuan Daoxian, Song Linghua, very prominent karst geologists to come to Oxford University in 1983 or 1984. From that, they met some of the British cavers, and I really want to acknowledge Andy Evis. There's a number, Peter Smart, Peter Bull. But what ended up happening is through these connections, the British went to Crown Cave in 1986, and really was the first major kind of joint Chinese Western cave expedition. They mapped something like more than 10 miles of cave, and just really fabulous. I will point out that Shushaka had been to Crown Cave. I didn't do the math, but 300 or 400 years before that, and it was actually mapping it. But I'm sure they got into parts of the cave that Shushaka didn't see. So around the same time, Chang Shouyu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, he was involved with UIS, International Union of Speleology, and because of that, the international connection, he was able to reach out to a British and excuse me, French and Belgian cavers and scientists. And so the first expeditions, the British were going in through Guilin, and then the French primarily were going in through their connections with Chang Shouyu into Guizhou, and this it's just incredible. I mean, they're just sort of when they got their first trips into Guizhou, it's like we go to a farm now and say go knock on the door and say you have any caves. This is a whole continent essentially opened up to them, and so some of the very earliest work was the work at in Guizhou in the mid to late 80s. In 1989, they had the Gebihe Gebiha 89 expedition, in which they found, among other things, the Meow Room, which is still one of the two largest cave rooms ever discovered in the world. At least, if you look up on the list right now, the Sarawak Chamber in at Mulu is the largest by floor area, and the Meow Room in Gebiha Cave in Guizhou is the biggest by volume. Andy Evis and team went back in 2014 with LiDAR sort of things, and it turns out there's a place in this cave room that's 1,000 feet tall. The ceiling's 1,000 feet above the floor. So just fabulous, and they just had the entire country open to them. Now, what ended up happening was that I was kind of hearing about this, and as a caver, and pretty soon I thought, man, I would cut my arm off to go to China. So I would just dying to go there, and with some of this stuff getting out. And it looked like, for many people, the first really opportunity was the International Association of Hydrogeologists in 1988 had their congress, and so that really was, Will, and I think Will was there. A lot of the American Karst geologists, that was their first time to get into China. I had two problems associated with being a grad student at University of Virginia, and I'm being a little flippant. UVA took very, very good care of me. One was I couldn't afford a plane ticket to China, and I do want to say the other thing was I was in Jane and Herman's aqueous geochemistry class, so I wasn't going anywhere. And I wanted to really take a moment because I know Janet has really been one of the key folks, with Karst Waters Institute. And I don't know if Janet's on the call or not. But I wanted to take a second to call Janet out. That class, there's a lot of people in all our careers, that you sort of meet people, and there's inflection points, and a lot of us in this group somehow started off as cavers and got spit out as scientists, out the other end somehow. And there's various inflection points, for me, Nick Crawford certainly. But I want to say Janet's aqueous geochemistry class. Kara Wicks was the TA. That was an inflection point in my career, and I'm still impacted by it. That not just the things that I learned there, but the way of thinking. One of the first times that I was with Janet, she introduced me to someone and said, "Oh, he's interested in car systems," and I'm like, "Car systems? What is that?" And so I'm just very grateful to Janet for that, and I'm just kind of mentioning that now. But anyway, so the meeting came and went, and so what ended up happening though was, in 1994. Chang Shiyue was coming to a meeting in Cuba, and he wrote Nick Crawford at WKU a letter, and said, "Well, I'm going to be in the U.S. Can I come by WKU and um, Mammoth Cave?" And Nick, in fact, another inflection point. And again, I'm very grateful to Nick. I saw Nick in the hall one day, and he had this letter, and he said, "Oh, I've heard from this guy in China, and I know you have an interest in that. Do you want to mess with them?" And so I wrote back. One thing for those of you that do international caving today, one thing to understand, it's easy to get up, one morning, there's 3 emails from China. In those days, it was 10 days for a letter each way. So if you had a question for somebody, you'd write a letter like, "How's it going, man?" 10 days. If they had stamps and envelopes and were not doing anything, they'd send it back. So by the time it got back, it was 3 weeks, and it was like, "Yeah, I'm okay." And so that's how it was. But so I wrote to Professor Chong and said, "Come on," and so he came and stayed with Dean and I at our place for a week, and we went around with Joe Myman and Marty Ryan, and just had a big time. And so when Professor Chong went back to China, he said, "Well, I can't." Oh, well, and in fact, I want to say Professor Chang Shiyue, he had also been the Chinese side of the Gabihe expeditions and the work with the French in Guizhou. So we were sitting at our kitchen table at night. He's showing me these maps, and literally, there's a map, that's got these huge rooms in it and passages taken off. And there's a passage that sort of goes along, and those of you that map caves will know, if you're mapping along a passage and you turn around before it ends, there's a couple dotted lines, show it continues. there was places 100 feet wide like that, and I'm going, what was how do you turn around in a 100 foot long, 100 foot wide gay passage? And he said there was just other things to do. I mean, we just we did everything we could. So I'm going, oh man. And so Professor Chong says, well, I can't fund you to come to China, but if you can somehow ever get over here, you tell me whoever you want to meet, and I'll invite you. So it turned out, the next year, 95. And I want to also acknowledge Wei Ping Pan, from WKU. He's retired now, but through an exchange program he had in chemistry, I was able to, Dean and I traveled to China the next year. So we went to Beijing and visited Professor Chong in Beijing. He had also been the organizer of the International Congress of Speleology, in not long before that, and his apartment was still filled with swag posters and T-shirts and stuff from the Congress. But he was very gracious. And then when we were arranging the trip, I said, the one place I'd like to go in China is Guilin. Can you make an introduction? So anyway, Dean and I made our way to Guilin in the summer of 95, here with Li Bin and Lin Yushan. And it was fabulous. And we went around for several days. They were just so gracious. And what ended up happening was that I gave a talk there at the institute, and they didn't know who in the world I was, and obviously Professor Yuan, like I was a fanboy, and just a leading light. So I was just beside myself. So anyway, I gave this talk, and work that Joe Myman and I were doing at Mammoth Cave that had to do with CO2 and just limestone dissolution and various things. And at the end of the talk, Professor Yuan, came up to me and he said, "Well, this is very interesting. Could you take a few minutes and sit down and have some tea with me?" And so we went in his office and spent an hour. And it was life changing. One thing that I still live my life today is you just don't know what's going to happen in 10 minutes from now, and I had no expectations. I hope to go back to China, but I didn't have any plans for it. And so Professor Yuan said, well, the CO2 that you're working on, actually has all kinds of interesting applications, because of the interactions with the atmosphere and rising CO2. And he said, at that time he was leading IGCP 379, a UNESCO science project that was called Global Karst Processes in the Global Carbon Cycle. And he said, what you're doing, pretty good with the data loggers that Joe was so expert at, and they were not using for Karst research in China yet at that time. He said, "Why don't you kind of join in our project?" And so from that meeting, from that cup of tea, now as Ben said, I've been another 43 times. I want to acknowledge 42 of them have been research. Two of them have been that Nina and I have adopted our two daughters. We have one that's in medical school, Lillian, and I think she's on. So I just want to acknowledge Lillian and just how much that this whole business is in our lives. And then Leah's off in engineering school up in Boston. So but anyway, the trip was fabulous. So anyway, we laughed. And then started various collaborations that come right up until today. And so just in a panoply of these things, in 2000, Dean and I went back for the first time with Alan Glennon, who was a grad student at WKU at that time. And we did several things. One is that Alan was very good at GIS. And so Alan gave a GIS workshop there, and we took the first ESRI software to the Karst community. They had GIS there, but it was a Chinese project or product. And Alan gave a very nice workshop over a few days. And then we also did a project where we went to some caves in Guilin, and what we were doing is working with Daryl Granger from Purdue University, and he had just come up with this business about using cosmogenic isotopes, uranium and beryllium, or excuse me, radioactive aluminum and beryllium, for dating of cave levels. And so we went on that trip. We ran through a bunch of caves in the Guilin area, finding pebbles. I want to acknowledge in the kind of one thing is the guy in the blue jacket there. I mentioned Professor Lean a moment ago from my first trip. He went on several trips with us, and it turned out that one of his areas of expertise was snakes. And so whenever we were going to places where there was a lot of, not whenever, but a lot of times they were very gracious to send Professor Lean, and we had some very nice conversations. And apparently in that part of China, if you show up at home at the end of the day work with a cobra in your hand for dinner, you are the man. So I want to acknowledge Professor Lean, who's also retired now. So in 2002, and in fact, I'll say that the gravels, we just did not get good data, and I don't know really what ended up happening, but it really was not. It was great, but we did not make any big advancements on understanding the geomorphology of Guilin, for full disclosure. However, in 2002. We went back, and this really kind of started the early real scientific collaborations with the folks at the institute. And I want to acknowledge Joe Myman, who's retired from the Park Service. He was the data logger guru. We were using Campbell's back in those days. And what had happened was that as I was getting to know the Chinese, the Karst folks were not using data loggers yet. And so when they were kind of learning about our work at Mammoth Cave, Professor Yuan said, well, if we don't really have access to get those, so if there's some way, when you come back to China, if you can bring some in for us, then we'll reimburse you. So we did. It's a longer story, but I'll just say I put $6,000 of data loggers and probes and whatever on my credit card. Joe and I, and there was a 100% duty, as far as we knew. And so we were just kind of, we were just going to go through customs and hope for the best. So we showed up at Shenzhen with, a duffel bag full of all this stuff. And we didn't know if they were going to, confiscate it or not. I mean, it wasn't illegal or anything, but we just didn't have $6,000 to pay the tariffs. And so the only time ever that I saw Joe take his hair and tuck it up under his hat. We went through customs, and turned out the guy was chatting up a girl, and we never did ever, we went on through, and everything worked out great, and we had a fabulous time. So we set up this place at Spring 31 at the Yaji experimental site in Guilin, and Professor Yuan and Claude Drogue from France had done work there in the 80s, and originally monitored it. That's where the weirs and stuff came from, the original structures there where Joe is. But they covered it up, and we instrumented, and still instrumented today. I'm happy to say that with Liu Saihua and others, we published our first papers, from that work at Spring 31. And then since then have had, reasonably successful series of, various papers in collaboration with the folks in Guilin and at Southwest University in Chongqing. And I want to really acknowledge Yang Pingheng at Southwest. We were there a couple of years ago. There's our honor student Evie Dukes, and so the site's still going. Much the data logs are much easier to take care of, but really just a fabulous place. So then what happened was through time, we're having opportunities to go there. And both Professor Yuan and I and our colleagues had kind of evolved where we would go out to someplace in China, we would park, walk through the, rural areas and through villages and things. And we were doing very academic stuff, like, here's some quartz gravels, is this cave 1 million years old or 1 billion years old? Is interesting stuff. But it wasn't really, and everything doesn't need to be applied, and not everything I do is applied. But I started thinking that, for the effort, the expense, and I loved it, but for the effort to get there in China, to visit these places and see these fantastic things, could we turn our attention to more applied things, water supply, and really just somehow improving the quality of life, for the people. in the Karst areas of southwest China. And I'll say, in part because of the difficult environmental problems, these are also among some of the poorest areas of China. So our first major project, and in fact, this was the trip where we adopted Lillian, was up in Hunan, and we were going to Guilin to visit. And they said, "Oh, we have a new project in Hunan. Why don't we ride up there?" So we went up there. They didn't really say much about the cave or the project, but we're coming up this river valley, and there's a 700-foot waterfall, emerging from this enormous cave. And the short story is that the engineers were wanted to build a dam up in the cave to raise the water table, upstream, to make water more accessible at the plateau at the top. Now, one thing about these areas is that they get similar rainfall on an annual basis to what we have in the eastern U.S., but there's a very distinct dry and a wet season, and so most of the rain comes in the summer, and so a lot of the karst areas are very difficult circumstances and people carrying water in the dry winter time. So anyway, so we went up there and they said, "Oh, by the way, can you organize a cave diving expedition?" Because there's a flooded section up in there, and the engineers, they want to see if we could map that out. And so I said, "Well, yeah, we probably could. It couldn't be real quick." And this was in January, and they said, "Well, it's got to be before the wet season starts. So can you do it pretty quick?" So I got with Pat Cambyses, who was working on our team at that time, and I want to acknowledge Pat's been in the middle of all this. And so Pat, we organized. Pat actually led the diving expedition. This is Dave Black and also Ron Simmons. And that was actually the first time. A lot of our work in China, we had to get there, buy the plane tickets, but they put us up there. That was actually the first time they said, "Well, we'll even buy the plane ticket." So anyway, very successful. As many of you knew, Ron unfortunately has passed away, so let's be mindful of him today. But just a fabulous trip. I know I keep saying that, but I'm out of adjectives. One thing that really drives me in a lot of this is I just love big cave passages, and this is back up in that cave at the top of the waterfall, and there's a caver for scale there. So that's actually an old dam that they had built previously, and they were trying in this effort to actually shut off the entire cave passage. Since then, this area is on the Yunnan Guizhou Plateau escarpment. Kind of like the Cumberland Plateau escarpment, but king sized. And now the area where Dalong Dong Big Dragon Cave is now a UNESCO Global Geopark. Just a wonderful place, fantastic caves. So then a funny thing happened when we were on those expeditions. There was a lot of coverage. There's a lot of media in China, and what I think happened was the owners of another cave in Hunan, a Wanhua Yen cave, the 10,000 Flowers cave, they had heard about they saw there's these American cavers on the news, and so I think that they thought, well, if we organize an expedition, we can kind of get some of that same coverage. So we heard through the Karst Institute, the folks from Huahoyan, and said, well, can you bring a team and train us about cave mapping and how to interpret the cave. So another great trip. There's Pat Cambyses. That's a group we call the Yellow Jackets. She's teaching them how to survey caves. We did dye tracing. There's Johanna Kovarik on the left. Ben Tobin. They're kind of in the middle, and just really another fun time. Map caves. It turned out that by pure coincidence, Cave Research Foundation had been to this cave. An American team before that, but Pat, the team that Pat led, actually went further and did made educational things and really kind of helped the people out. So one thing I'll point out, kind of in the upper right, you can see. One thing about caving in China is everything that just the kind of the local people in China are fabulous cave explorers. Anywhere you can get to with shiny black shoes, even if it's terrifying, they had been. But places with big rivers, big pits, they were just wide open. So we had various cave mapping there. So then in 2006, through back in the days of pork spending appropriations, we ended up somehow or other through Senator McConnell's office, the Kentucky senator, hitting on a $2 million project with funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, and that went on for several years, and it was a training in karst water resources because there really just was not very much experience. There was a lot of cavers, this time, had been there, but there was not. A well-developed academic infrastructure. So we worked for several years. On the left, you'll see Will and Bet there. John Martin from Florida was on this trip. Nico Goldscheider. We were doing training with various workshops. I also want to acknowledge Kate Webb, who's the associate dean of the Science College, Ogden College at WKU, she's a chemist and very interested in limestone, and she was on this trip, and just she's been a fantastic supporter really of this whole time. So things that we did. We did training. That's actually the same picture of Ben again, but we actually set up a lab, essentially a clone to the Crawford lab with a spectrophotometer at Southwestern University. We did training on cave survey, we were trying to help them understand how to have, expeditions. Some of you will recognize Brian Ham on the bottom and Bruce Hatcher, students at the time. Also, Melissa Hendrickson was a grad student at that time. Also, because a lot of the caves in these big plateaus are deep, we had training and a number of workshops, that we did over there, and expeditions in Yunnan. On single rope techniques. And there's Andrea Crosscreed that some of you know. All these people have gone on to become sort of karst regulars in the meantime. We also set up a GIS laboratory, 6 computers and licenses for ArcInfo, I think it was at that time. A part of this was USAID had a 25% cost share. It's much more complex, but they had a 25% cost share requirement, which I didn't know, well, that I had been led to believe, we would not be held to. And then somewhere along the way, they said, well, where's the 25%? Which, you can do the math, comes out to, a lot of money for a $2 million grant. It turned out that the people at ESRI wrote a letter and said, we're giving you an educational discount of, whatever the amount was, for the match. And so Western came up, with a good amount. But a lot of it was a very kind person at ESRI that wrote a letter that said we're contributing the license for this enormous amount of money. And then kind of eventually, what we got into was what I call training the trainers. We were training people at Southwest University and in Guilin. Ultimately the students and the people that we were working with, they end up, we just had bigger and bigger, audiences, and eventually the people in both Southwest University and Guilin were providing training for various provincial hydrologists from the karst-rich provinces of Southwest China. So I can say I can't really say there's a particular town or village that has better water from this, but I am confident that the academic infrastructure for karst hydrogeology in China is advanced from the work of WKU and our colleagues there. One kind of side project is not related to karst, but it turned out during the USAID funding, we came across a group called A Child's Right. And one of the problems in China with water, there's a lot, but there essentially is no treated drinking water. You can go to a hotel in Beijing, $400 a night. Don't drink the water. It's just not treated. Generally, people will boil water, which takes care of the bacteria. But a very vulnerable population were what are called social welfare institutes or orphanages. And because when there's 3 caregivers for 50 kids, they just can't be boiling water to make formula and cooling it and such and such. So we worked with Child's Right, and I'm happy to say we documented this. We put with the Child's Right, used the funding and put in, and I can't remember the number of water systems, but 50 some throughout Southwest China, and it was documented over 14,000 kids. And in fact, the picture there, those kids there, that's not set up. That was literally those kids drinking safe water for the first time in their lives. And the people from Child's Right, that was such a joy, because every time they would work with these kids and get these pictures. It was fantastic. Um, Along the way, we have kind of gravitated towards resource conservation. I mentioned UNESCO, and along the way, the South China Karst World Heritage Site was established, and we worked in 2007 or 2009, I guess, with the National Park Service to develop a sister park arrangement between Mammoth Cave World Heritage Site and the South China Karst World Heritage Site. That's Pat Reed, who was the superintendent at that time of Mammoth Cave. So we went over and visited several of the different sites, all spectacular. I want to acknowledge the guy in the kind of in the back row with the kind of the tan suit on. Fort from Right. That's Rudy D'Alessandro, who I met at that time. And he was essentially responsible for China for the World Heritage Program in the United States through the National Park Service. And so Rudy has just been a great collaborator. We're still working together. In fact, he may be down here, by the end of this month. We're hoping to get some folks from the Chinese embassy down here. I need to say, Rudy, unfortunately, lost his job this spring. The current administration has shut down the entire international programs, Forest Service, the National Park Service, all that just gone. And so Rudy, his office was just shut down, but he still engaged him and John Putnam and others. Just very grateful for continuing to work, just as private citizens because of the passion that they have for these things. So anyway, we've continued. I'll jump through about the next 15 years, but we've done a lot of work with the Chinese on, particularly CO2 and water atmosphere interactions, training through IRCK. We've had great success with the China Scholarship Council. 5 postdocs have been have come to our lab, fully funded for a year from the Chinese government, and been very successful. Yang Ping Hung, I mentioned. Sad to say also, Yang Ping Hung, who was here for a year, very, very successful trip. He's been turned down twice. He's got the funding from China, but the State Department has turned him down twice in the current environment. So there's nothing good to say about that. There's no reason for that. So anyway, a little self-aggrandizement, but I will say a highlight of this was, and I want to kind of acknowledge the folks in Guilin of getting what's called the International Science Cooperation Award, and then later what's called the Friendship Award. And the thing I'll say about it is that, for awards like this, the effort is not from the awardee. It's from the people that went to the work for the nominations. And my friends from Gwen literally worked for 5 years on these nominations, videos. They went trips to Beijing, and so I'm so grateful, and it shows to the strength of the relationships. So anyway, COVID, of course, closed down China. So we weren't there for a couple of years, but as soon as it opened back up again, we were back there. I've had several students go back. For full disclosure, this Chinese woman in the picture is my younger daughter Leah, who's at engineering up in Northeastern. She's been back several times, and actually getting pretty good at her Chinese. I want to play a little clip here. This is Evie Dukes, who also went back with us. This is 2024, and I'm going to play this. It may be hard to hear, but let me get and start it up. Yeah, so you didn't really understand that if it sounded garbled, that's because Evie was speaking in Chinese, and we're also very lucky at WKU to have what's called the China Flagship Program, a very, very high end Chinese language program, and so it's been a nice collaboration to be able to work with some of those students, including Evie. Now I want to end up with a little kind of a strange little twist here, and but fabulous. And that is, I want to acknowledge my friend Tom Gilbert here. Tom is 97. He lives over in the Smokies and was ran the national education program for the National Park Service, for many years until he retired in 1980. And so I worked with him on UNESCO, projects. And this guy literally, it was from his brain came from the UNESCO Man in the Biosphere program. And so I won't get a lot more into it, but let me tell you that I was over visiting Tom in the Smokies in 2024, and we were talking about China, and he said, when I was in the Park Service in the 1970s, my boss at that time, Ron Walker, was the guy that led Richard Nixon's advance trip to China. And one of the things that Tom told me was when Nixon went there, they took a couple of these small baby California redwood trees. And the idea was to plant them, because they lived for 2,000 years, as a long-term symbol of, peace and cooperation. So Tom said, you're spending time in China. You ought to see if you can't track down what happened to those trees. So I said, okay. So a little bit of research turns up that the on a website of a Chinese diplomat in the U.S. It turned out there is not only one of the trees, that's the one that Nixon planted, is in Hangzhou, China, and doing well enough. But the crazy part, when I realized it was going to be that this tree was in Hangzhou, I was actually headed to Hangzhou this past September with a group from representing the U.S. at the World Congress of UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, and so I thought, holy smoke, I didn't know what this could mean, but I thought this is there's going to be some Americans at this UNESCO meeting in Hangzhou. It's right there where this tree is. So I started this campaign without having any idea of sort of how things would play out, to try to say, there's going to be some Americans in Hangzhou. Can we do something? A little celebration, just something, to celebrate, 50 years later. So so there's Leah and Evie and I at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, meeting with the MAB National Committee. It turned out that they did some research, and it turned out they learned about the tree. And one of the things that they told me was this woman on the right, Zhu Xuan, was a famous Chinese opera singer in the 70s, and she had actually written a song about Nixon's tree. And back in the 70s, a lot of people in China knew about Nixon's visit, and they were very excited about it. And the tree, it's pretty much forgotten now. But so I learned more about it through Rudy D'Alessandro, from the Park Service. Through his connections, I ended up, with Rudy, and in fact, Rose and you here on the right from the Paulson Institute. We went to the Chinese embassy in Washington twice and said, look, we're going to be in Hangzhou. Could we do something? So finally, the folks at the embassy got excited, and it turned out Zhejiang province, where Hangzhou is, they ended up hosting an event that we had at the as kind of a side event at the World Congress. So there was about 50 people there. There's Nixon's tree, and what I want to end with is I'm not going to show the whole thing, but this was just fantabulous, and I'm out of adjectives to use, but they set up this event, and this group of kids, these 16 elementary school kids, came out and sang the song about Richard Nixon's tree, and I just want to play just a little bit of it here, if it'll work. Okay, so I just wanted to play enough where you can Here the little girl, they're solo. For some reason, there was 15 little girls and one little boy there. I'm not sure, but they had worked so hard. It was over 100 degrees. Like everybody was sweating, but we were all sweating together. It was just a wonderful, wonderful time. Oh, sorry. So anyway, at the trip in Hangzhou, I'm happy to say that several of my friends from Guilin and actually Southwest University flew up to Hangzhou, so we can meet. This is two of the kind of the rising stars in Guilin, and Leo Chukan, Mary on the left, and by being on the right here. And we actually we met at that meeting, kind of a side meeting, and have actually just turned in a proposal for a multi-year project to the Ministry of Science and Technology that'll hopefully involve joint training and monitoring in China and here in the U.S. So with that. Like I said, I'm out of adjectives. That's just kind of the story of this just wonderful, the parade. I guess we're continuing in the future, and I'll leave it there. And I've pretty much used up my time. But if there's a few minutes for questions, I'm happy to do that. And thanks again to Ben and Ellen. Thank you.